The phone buzzes, and I glance at the credit card statement. The charges under his name. Still, I stay calm, my fingers curling around the paper, trying to steady my heart. As the smell of coffee fills the room, the weight of his betrayal presses down. While he thinks I haven't noticed, I see the truth in black and white. That's when I decide. He's crossed a line. I dial the number, and with one call, I freeze his future. Because this betrayal ends now. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the bright sunlight streaming through the windows, a stark contrast to the darkness brewing in her chest. She stared at the credit card statement spread out before her, the numbers and charges blurring together into a sickening knot of disbelief. The total balance was higher than it should have been, but it was the line items that made her blood run cold. There were transactions, big ones, made at upscale restaurants, clothing stores, and even a luxury hotel, all in the past few months, and all of them bore the name James Taylor. At first, she assumed it was a mistake, a mix-up with her account, or some sort of fraudulent charge. But as she dug deeper into the statement, every detail screamed the same thing. Her son, her only child, had been using her credit card without asking. For months. Her fingers trembled as she skimmed through the charges, the weight of betrayal sinking deeper into her bones with every transaction. The sum was staggering. She felt a tightness in her throat, the familiar rush of frustration and hurt rising within her. How could he do this? Did he really think she wouldn't notice? Her mind raced through every conversation, every emergency James had mentioned to her over the last few months. I need a little extra for rent this month, or things are tight, Mom. All of them now seemed like elaborate justifications for a behavior she had never suspected, until now. A cold, quiet anger settled into her chest as she grabbed her phone, dialing the number she knew by heart. Margaret, James's voice came through, casual and unsuspecting. I need to talk to you, she said, her voice steady but laced with an edge she hoped he would notice. Now. The line crackled for a moment before he responded, sounding surprised but not concerned. What's going on? I'm just about to head out with Rachel. Can it wait? No, James, it can't wait. There was a brief silence and Margaret felt her pulse quicken. I know what you've been doing, she said, each word feeling heavier than the last. I've seen the charges on my credit card. James's silence stretched for a moment before he let out a small, dismissive laugh. Mom, seriously? That? It's no big deal. I needed the money for some things. Emergencies. Emergencies? Margaret echoed, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. You've been using my card for months without asking me. That's not an emergency? That's stealing. There was a long pause before James spoke again, his voice a mixture of disbelief and defiance. Mom, come on, it's not like I'm spending all of it. Just a few dinners here and there, a couple of things I needed. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. Margaret closed her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the heat rising in her face, the anger that had been building in her for days now surging to the surface. It wasn't just the money, it was the disrespect, the total disregard for her boundaries, her trust. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to keep calm. I don't care if it's just a few dinners, James. You've crossed a line. I never gave you permission to use my credit card. And you're not entitled to anything from me, no matter what you think. For a moment, there was only the sound of James shifting on the other end of the line. Then he spoke again, his voice softer, but still laced with frustration. You don't understand, Mom. Things have been tough. I'm trying to get by, and I didn't think you'd mind. It's not like I'm asking for a handout, just a little help. Margaret's jaw clenched. This was no longer about money. It was about the way James had always tried to manipulate her, to play on her emotions to get what he wanted. He wasn't sorry, he was just trying to justify himself. "You should have respected me enough to ask," she said, her voice cold. "Instead, you just took. And that, James, is something I will not tolerate anymore." There was silence again, but this time it was thicker, more tense. James's next words were laced with annoyance. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Mom. I was just in a bad spot. Can't you understand that?" Margaret took another breath, her resolve hardening with each passing second. "What I understand, James, is that you've taken advantage of my trust, and that's something I can't forgive. You've crossed a line, and I won't let you manipulate me into thinking I'm the one at fault here." James scoffed. "You're overreacting. I mean, come on. It's just a few charges. It's not like I'm asking for the world." Margaret's heart was pounding in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "No, James. The line is crossed. And it's not just about the money. It's about respect. You've shown me none." She heard him mutter something under his breath, but she was done listening. "I'll be dealing with this. And you need to understand something. This won't be swept under the rug. Not this time." Margaret ended the call before James could respond, the weight of her decision settling over her like a storm cloud. She was done. She had finally reached the breaking point. She was about to freeze his future in a way that would make him finally face the consequences of his actions, and she was ready to watch him squirm. The silence in Margaret's home felt like an open wound. Her phone, still warm from the conversation with James, lay on the kitchen counter, a stark reminder of the conversation she had just ended. The air was thick, oppressive with unresolved anger, but more than that, it carried a sense of purpose. For the first time in a long while, Margaret felt like she was no longer a passive participant in her son's manipulation. She wasn't going to let him slide this time. Without another word, she walked to her purse, grabbed her wallet, and pulled out the credit card, the one that had caused everything to unravel. It was smooth in her hand, cold and impersonal, like a small weapon in her grasp. She wasn't just holding a piece of plastic anymore. She was holding the key to her independence, to her power, and to the boundaries that James had so callously crossed. Margaret dialed the number on the back of the card. The ringing sound seemed to echo in her mind, and she steadied her breathing, focusing on what she had to do. A woman's voice greeted her, professional, but distant. "Hello. This is Karen from the Fraud Protection Department. How may I assist you today?" "I need to freeze my credit card account," Margaret said, her voice firm, betraying no sign of the storm still swirling inside her. "Immediately." The woman's voice paused as if surprised by the request. "Certainly, ma'am. May I ask why?" Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "I've had unauthorized charges on my account. I want everything locked down now." "Understood. Please hold while I process this request." The minutes ticked by, but Margaret barely noticed the time. She was no longer thinking about James's excuses, or his manipulations, or how he had always come crawling back to her when things didn't go his way. She was past all of that. This wasn't just about a credit card. It was about taking control of the narrative, of regaining the power she had slowly allowed him to strip from her over the years. When the call ended, Margaret didn't feel relief, nor did she feel triumph. She felt something more complex, the quiet resolve of someone who had finally drawn a line. No more giving in, no more excuses. She placed the phone down and walked to her study, where the thick file of legal documents and trust papers rested on her desk. The one person who could help her navigate what she had just done was Kenneth Grant, her longtime lawyer. He had always been the steady, pragmatic voice in her life, and now, more than ever, she would need him to help make sure James couldn't turn this into some kind of manipulative game. The moment she dialed his number, she felt the weight of her decision become real. Kenneth answered on the third ring, his voice calm as always. Margaret, how can I help you today? I need to meet with you, Margaret said, her voice unwavering. This isn't something I can handle alone anymore. There was a brief pause before Kenneth responded, sensing the gravity in her words. Of course. Let's set up a time. What's going on? I froze my credit card, she said, the words feeling like a declaration of war. I'm done, Kenneth. I'm done with James, and I want to take action. Margaret, he said, his tone cautious. I want you to think carefully. This could create a rift. A serious one. He may challenge this. You know how he can be. I know, she replied, the decision now firm in her gut. But I don't care. This time, he needs to understand the consequences of his actions. I'm not going to keep covering for him. Kenneth was quiet for a moment. You're sure? Yes, Margaret said, and there was a finality in her voice. I want him out of everything. He doesn't deserve a thing, not a cent. Not a piece of my life, my wealth, or my legacy. Kenneth sighed, the weight of the situation settling into their conversation. I understand, Margaret. But I must warn you, this will be a legal battle. If you go through with this, it won't be an easy fight. Margaret's grip tightened on the desk, her nails pressing into the wood. She could already feel the storm of James's wrath building on the horizon, but for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. I'm ready. I've already made my decision. Kenneth exhaled softly. All right. We'll move forward with this then. I'll prepare the necessary paperwork for the will, and we'll start taking steps to protect your assets. Margaret hung up the phone, a wave of calm flooding her as the reality of her decision settled in. She was no longer just reacting to James's behavior. She was taking control, stepping into her own power, no longer afraid of the fallout. For years she had tried to manage him, to balance the weight of her love for him with the reality of his irresponsibility. But now, that chapter was closed. As she sat back in her chair, her gaze fell on the photo of her late husband that sat on the corner of her desk. She thought about the promises she'd made to him, to protect their family, to keep their legacy intact. This wasn't just about James anymore. It was about protecting everything they had built together. The legacy she had forged would not be destroyed by a son who thought he was entitled to it. And as she leaned back in her chair, her thoughts turned to the future. This was just the beginning. What she had just set in motion would change everything. James wouldn't know what hit him. Margaret's hand hovered over the document, the ink of her pen poised above the final section. The words were there, already typed, already ready to sever ties. It felt surreal, almost impossible, that she was about to cut her son out of everything. But she knew, deep down, that it was the only choice left. She had already frozen her credit card, and now, here she was, making the final, irrevocable decision. James was no longer just a disappointment. He was an intruder, someone who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Kenneth sat across from her, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the storm of emotions swirling within her. He was flipping through the thick legal folder that had just been prepared for her. A mixture of concern and respect softened the edges of his face as he glanced up at her. Margaret, he began carefully, his voice carrying the weight of both friendship and professional duty. Are you sure about this? We've discussed the potential fallout. This will be a major shift. Not just for him, but for the family. It's going to cause waves. Margaret's eyes never wavered from the document in front of her. She could hear his words, but they didn't change the fire that had been lit inside her. The hurt, the anger, the years of manipulation had all led to this moment. The moment where she finally took control. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, she said, her voice low but firm. Her gaze hardened, and she finally pressed the pen to the paper. The finality of it made her feel something she hadn't in years. Power. The power to protect herself. To protect what was hers. Kenneth exhaled softly, glancing down at the will once more. All right, but understand. Once this is signed, there's no turning back. James will never inherit a thing. Not a cent. Not a single possession. He's completely cut out. There's no room for negotiation. I know, Margaret said, not lifting her eyes from the page. He doesn't deserve anything after what he's done. Kenneth paused, his brow furrowing slightly. He was trying to understand, trying to reconcile his professional obligation with his sympathy for Margaret. But even he couldn't ignore the undeniable truth in her words. This wasn't about money. It was about respect. About boundaries that had been trampled for too long. He's your son, Margaret, Kenneth said softly. No matter what's happened, no matter the damage he's caused, he's still your flesh and blood. Are you ready to completely sever that connection? She could hear the hesitation in his voice, the faint undercurrent of caution. But there was no room for doubt in her decision. Margaret sat up straighter, her spine aligning with the finality of her words. I've given him every chance, Kenneth, every opportunity to do the right thing, to show respect. And he's chosen to take advantage of that. He's crossed a line I can't forgive. No more chances. Kenneth's silence stretched long, and for a moment, Margaret almost felt the weight of his judgment. But she refused to back down. She had to protect herself now. She couldn't let her son's entitlement continue to dictate her life. He had already taken too much, and she wasn't going to let him take any more. She looked up at Kenneth, her eyes steely, her resolve unshakable. It's done. He's out. Kenneth nodded, his expression softening as he picked up the pen. All right, Margaret. If this is your decision, then let's finalize it. He placed the pen in front of her, the same pen she had just held moments ago. She gripped it again, her fingers steady, her heart calm. She signed the papers, the ink sinking into the paper like the weight of a promise to herself, a promise to the life she had worked so hard to build. Kenneth handed her the document, the final copy. It's official, he said quietly. James is no longer part of your will. He's been disinherited. Margaret felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. There was no guilt, no second guessing. Just an overwhelming relief that she had finally done what was necessary, what she should have done long ago. But as the words settled, a thought nagged at her. What would this mean for the future? James was sure to fight her decision, to try to manipulate his way back into her life. She could already feel the weight of that battle on the horizon. Kenneth placed his hand on the pile of papers, his voice steady but laced with warning. You're prepared for what's coming, aren't you? This won't be easy for you. He will fight this. He'll try to make you the villain. Margaret stood up from her chair, a slow, deliberate motion. She was tall, commanding even in the most vulnerable of moments. I've been the villain for too long, Kenneth, she said softly, but with iron in her tone. Now, I'm just the woman who's finally standing up for herself. Kenneth gave a small, appreciative nod. Just remember, you have more than just your wealth to protect. This could tear the family apart. Margaret's eyes softened for a moment, her thoughts flashing to her sister, Sophie, and the few friends who might never understand. But then the thought of James, his entitlement, his refusal to respect her, swept over her again. She had no room left for hesitation. I've made my choice, she said quietly, her voice steady. And I'm ready for whatever comes next. As Margaret turned away, she glanced at the framed photograph of her husband, his smiling face forever frozen in time. She felt his presence, his steady support, and in that moment, she knew. This was the legacy she would protect. Not the one James had expected, but the one she had worked so hard to build on her own terms. She was ready. The phone rang, slicing through the silence in Margaret's home like a needle. Her fingers paused mid-motion as she reached for it, already knowing who was calling before she even looked at the screen. It was James. She hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision still fresh in her mind. She had made her choice. She had severed the final tie that bound her to him. But that didn't stop the flutter of nervousness that fluttered in her chest, like a bird unsure of its fate. She answered the call. "Mom?" James's voice came through, hesitant but trying to sound warm. I need to talk." Margaret remained silent, holding the phone to her ear. She could already hear the undertones of guilt in his voice. It was the same tone he'd used when he wanted something, when he thought he could manipulate his way back into her life. She'd heard it before, many times. "I'm sorry about what happened," he continued. "I didn't mean to hurt you." Margaret could almost picture him. His head hung low, his voice shaky as though he was playing the part of the remorseful son. But it wasn't working. Not this time. "You didn't mean to?" Margaret said, her voice cool but steady. "You've been using my credit card without asking for months, James. I don't think sorry is enough to make up for that." He let out a long, drawn-out sigh, and she could almost see him running a hand through his hair, trying to pull together the right words. "Mom, you don't understand. I've been under a lot of pressure. Emergencies kept popping up. Things I couldn't control. You know how it is." Margaret bit back a bitter laugh. Emergencies. He always had an excuse ready, a reason to justify his actions. She knew all too well how this game played out. "Emergencies," she repeated, each syllable laced with disbelief. "You've used that excuse before, James. For months. But it doesn't change the fact that you never once asked for my permission. You crossed a line. And now, there's no going back." "Mom," he implored, his voice rising now, trying to reassert his control. "I didn't mean for it to get out of hand. Things were hard and I thought you'd understand. It's not like I'm asking for your whole fortune, just a little help when I needed it. You know I'd never take anything from you if I didn't have to." Margaret's grip on the phone tightened, the urge to end the conversation building inside her. This was the moment where his manipulations would either win him some sympathy or send him into deeper frustration. She couldn't afford to give him an inch. "You think I don't understand?" Margaret's voice remained calm, but the edge in it was unmistakable. "You think I haven't been through hard times myself? You think I don't know what it's like to struggle? You should have understood respect before you asked for anything." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Margaret could hear his shallow breaths, the weight of her words settling in. He wasn't expecting this. He thought he could talk his way out of it, like he always did. But she wasn't the same person who'd let him get away with it before. She was done. "Mom, please," he said, his voice small now, like a child cornered in a lie. "You don't understand what it's like. I've been—" "You're right," Margaret interrupted, her voice no longer giving him any leeway. "I don't understand what it's like to take someone's trust and abuse it. To live my life expecting everything to be handed to me. But I do understand what it means to protect my dignity and my boundaries. And you, James, have disrespected both." She took a deep breath, forcing her voice to remain steady, even as her heart felt like it was breaking. This was it. This was the moment where she told him, where she cut him off completely. "I've made my decision, James," she said, her words final. "You are no longer a part of my life in the way you thought you were. Effective immediately, you are removed from my will." The silence that followed felt like a vacuum. Margaret could feel the shock radiating from the other side of the phone. He was speechless, and for a moment, she could almost hear the gears turning in his mind, scrambling to find something, anything, that would bring him back from the precipice she had just pushed him over. "What?" James finally asked, his voice incredulous, rising in pitch. "You can't be serious." "I am," Margaret replied. This is no longer about money, James. This is about the lack of respect you've shown me. You've taken advantage of my generosity, and I'm done. You're out." There was a long pause, and in that moment, Margaret knew. She knew he would fight this. She knew the storm was coming. But for the first time, she didn't feel the fear or the doubt that used to paralyze her. She felt calm, in control. I don't know what to say," James stammered, his voice a mix of anger and desperation. "You're making a huge mistake. You can't do this." "I've already done it," Margaret replied quietly, her gaze steady, her heart unwavering. "And you need to accept it." The call ended abruptly, the click of the phone signaling the end of their conversation and the beginning of a battle that Margaret knew would be long and painful. But as she placed the phone down, she didn't feel regret. She didn't feel guilt. She felt only the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had done what was necessary. James would never understand. But Margaret had finally made him face the consequences of his actions, and the real test was about to begin. The letter arrived a week later. Margaret had prepared it carefully, each word a calculated decision, each sentence a final nail in the coffin. It was short, precise, and, most importantly, irrevocable. The official document that notified James of his removal from her will, the one that would sever him from her legacy permanently, was now in his hands. Margaret sat in the living room, staring out the window as the autumn leaves swirled in the breeze outside. She felt oddly calm. She had done what she needed to do. There was no turning back now. But she wasn't prepared for the phone call that came next. "Mom, what the hell is this?" James's voice was sharp, a mix of disbelief and anger, as he ripped through the silence of her home. "You can't be serious. This is some kind of joke, right?" Margaret allowed herself a single breath, the calm in her chest still holding strong. She had expected this. She had anticipated his outrage, his refusal to believe that she could ever truly follow through. He had spent his entire life assuming she would bail him out, that she would always be there to pick up the pieces when he failed. But not this time. Not anymore. "I'm serious, James," she replied, her voice clear, not a hint of hesitation. "You're out of my will. You no longer have any claim on my estate." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that felt like the earth had shifted beneath him. She could almost hear his mind scrambling, desperately trying to find a way to undo what had just been done. "This is insane," he spat, his tone rising with panic. "You don't mean it. You're just angry right now, but you'll get over it. Look, I didn't mean it like that. It was just a mistake. I didn't think it would—" "Don't try to manipulate me, James," Margaret interjected, her tone cutting through his excuses like a sharp blade. "I'm done making excuses for you. This is no longer about misunderstandings or mistakes. You crossed a line, and I'm done letting you do that." His voice was frantic now, the guilt he could no longer hide bleeding through the cracks. "I'm your son. You can't just— This isn't you, Mom. You're making a huge mistake, and I'm sorry, I really am. I didn't mean for any of this to get so out of hand. I've been going through so much lately. You know how it is." Margaret didn't flinch. She had heard every one of his excuses before. She had let them slide, time and time again, hoping he would change, hoping he would grow up. But he hadn't. And she wasn't going to be his crutch any longer. "You should have thought about that before you started stealing from me," she replied coldly. "This isn't about your struggles, James. It's about the lack of respect you've shown me. And now it's over. There's no going back." He tried to push further, his voice growing desperate. "Mom, please. You can't do this. Don't make this decision in anger. You know how I've always been there for you, when you needed me. You can't just erase everything like it never happened." Margaret's resolve hardened. The words he used, "you can't," only fueling her determination. "I've already done it, James. The decision is final, and it's not just about money. It's about respect. You lost that the moment you took what didn't belong to you. She hung up the phone before he could say anything else, the click of the call ending echoing in the silence of the room. But as she sat there, her phone began to ring again. This time, the call was from Kenneth. "Margaret, we need to talk," he said, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of urgency. "James has already contacted a lawyer. He's going to challenge the will." Margaret's heart sank, but her voice remained unwavering. "I figured as much." Kenneth paused, as though he was weighing his words carefully. "He's going to fight you, Margaret. He's telling people that you're overreacting, that you're making a huge mistake. He's spreading it around the family, trying to paint you as the villain." Margaret clenched her fists, feeling the old, familiar pang of guilt gnawing at her insides. She had always wanted to be the one who held the family together, but James's actions had shattered any illusions she had about what he really wanted from her. "I've already made my choice," she said firmly, "and I'm prepared for the fallout. Let him try to manipulate everyone else. He's the one who crossed the line, not me." Kenneth's voice softened, a touch of admiration slipping into his tone. "You're stronger than you think, Margaret. But just know, this is going to get messy. You'll need to be ready." "I am ready," she replied, the quiet certainty in her words underscoring her commitment. "This time, I won't back down." She hung up the phone and leaned back in her chair, staring at the framed photo of her late husband. She thought of the promises she had made to him, of the family they had built together. She wasn't going to let James destroy that legacy, not after everything he had taken from her. The storm was coming. She could feel it in her bones. But this time, Margaret would face it head-on. She wasn't afraid anymore. James would not get away with this. Not again. Margaret stood by the window. The familiar view of her quiet, suburban street stretched out before her. But it wasn't the trees or the houses she was focusing on. It was the file of legal documents in her hands. The papers were thick, heavy with the weight of the battle ahead. She had known it was coming. She had known James wouldn't accept his removal from her will without a fight. The phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She didn't need to check the caller ID. She already knew who it was. "Kenneth," she answered, her voice steady, betraying none of the uncertainty she felt inside. "Margaret, I need you to sit down," Kenneth said, his voice tight with the kind of urgency that always preceded bad news. "James has filed a lawsuit. He's claiming undue influence. He's accusing you of manipulating him into signing away his inheritance." Margaret closed her eyes briefly, her fingers curling around the papers in her hands. She had expected this, but hearing it out loud made it real. James wasn't going to give up easily. He was pulling out all the stops to make sure he didn't lose access to the money he thought he deserved. She could already hear his voice in her mind, full of indignation, filled with that sense of entitlement he had never outgrown. But it didn't matter anymore. She wasn't going to let him dictate her life any longer. She was done being his safety net. "Do you think he has a case?" Margaret asked, keeping her voice calm. "There's a chance," Kenneth admitted, his tone practical but firm. "He's going to argue that you pressured him, that you manipulated him into this decision. He's going to paint you as unstable, as someone who was acting out of anger rather than sound judgment." Margaret's jaw clenched, but she kept her posture upright. She had known this battle would be messy, but she had no doubt that she was right. The truth was on her side. "He's wrong," she said simply. "I haven't manipulated him. He crossed a line, Kenneth. This is about respect, not money. It's about the way he's treated me, and I'm not going to let him use me anymore." Kenneth was quiet for a moment, likely evaluating the situation. Margaret knew that for him, this wasn't just a legal matter. It was a personal one, too. He had been by her side for years, and he knew the toll that James's behavior had taken on her. He also knew how strong she was when she made up her mind. "Listen," Kenneth said, breaking the silence. "I've got the legal foundation we need. We'll fight this. We'll show that this decision was made by you, of your own free will. He's going to try to discredit you, but we'll fight back with everything we've got." Margaret's gaze hardened as she looked down at the papers again. She wasn't going to let James manipulate her anymore. He had tried to paint her as the villain for far too long. It was time for the world to see the truth. "Are you ready for this, Margaret?" Kenneth asked, sensing the moment of quiet resolve that had settled over her. "I've never been more ready," she replied. "I won't let him destroy everything I've worked for. Not this time." The lawsuit was just the beginning. James wasn't going to give up easily, and Margaret knew that. She could already feel the pressure mounting as his legal team began to attack her credibility. They would dig into her personal life, her emotions, try to twist every word she said, every action she took. But Margaret was ready. She had learned long ago that when it came to people like James, it wasn't just about the law. It was about the battle of wills. Kenneth was right. It would be a long fight. There would be days when it seemed like she might lose. But Margaret wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't afraid of her son's manipulation or the legal challenges ahead. She had already made her decision, and she would see it through. "I won't back down," Margaret said, her voice unwavering. "This is bigger than him. This is about showing him, and everyone else, that there are consequences for taking advantage of people. I've been weak for too long. I'm done being weak." Kenneth's voice softened, a trace of admiration in it now. "I know. And we're going to win this. But it's going to take everything we've got." Margaret stood up, walking toward her desk. She looked down at the framed photo of her late husband, his smiling face frozen in time. She thought about the promises she had made to him, and she knew, deep in her bones, that she couldn't let James ruin what they had built together. Not after everything. She was ready. The storm was coming, but Margaret wasn't going to hide from it. This time she was going to face it head-on. "I'm ready," she said softly, more to herself than to Kenneth. And with that, she hung up the phone and set her jaw. The fight ahead no longer something she feared, but something she embraced. The courtroom loomed ahead like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. Margaret could feel it in the pit of her stomach. That heavy pressure. The knowledge that this battle wasn't just about a will. It was about her entire life. About the years she had spent trying to love and protect her son, only to watch him betray her at every turn. James and his lawyer were playing their hand now, and it was exactly what Margaret had expected. The accusations were flying fast and thick, each one designed to erode her credibility. They were calling into question her mental state, suggesting that she was unstable, that the decision to disinherit her son was made out of anger, out of irrational emotion. The whispers of her supposed instability had already begun to circulate in the family, and Margaret felt a cold anger rise within her. She had been through so much. She had given everything to her family. And now, here she was, fighting for her dignity. Kenneth had briefed her on the tactics James's lawyer was using. He had brought up her age, her grief over losing her husband, the supposed emotional fragility that came with being a widow. They were trying to paint her as a woman who had cracked under pressure, who had let her emotions cloud her judgment. It sickened her. But Margaret was not afraid. She had something far more powerful than their accusations: the truth. Margaret sat in her study, the evening light fading as she flipped through the pages Kenneth had prepared. There were emails, bank statements, and legal documents, proof that James had been irresponsible long before he ever thought to take advantage of her. His behavior wasn't a sudden lapse. It was a pattern, one that Kenneth had carefully pieced together. James's constant spending, his inability to hold down a job, his tendency to borrow money from friends and family without paying it back, all of it was documented. And now it was in her hands, a weapon that would expose his true character to everyone. She paused on one page in particular, a letter from a financial advisor, dated just over a year ago, outlining James's reckless spending habits and warning him that he was on the brink of financial ruin. Margaret had seen the signs before, but she had never imagined he would go this far. She had trusted him. She had always believed that deep down he was a good person, someone who would eventually grow up and learn responsibility. But she had been wrong. And now she was paying the price for her misplaced faith. Kenneth had also uncovered something more damning: James's repeated attempts to borrow money from family members, always promising to pay it back, only to vanish when the debts came due. It wasn't just that he had stolen from her, it was that he had used his charm, his ability to manipulate, to keep everyone in his orbit taking and taking without ever giving anything back. Margaret's hand tightened around the papers as she leaned back in her chair. It wasn't just the money, it was the disrespect, the manipulation. He had stolen her trust, her security, her peace of mind, and he had used the very family bonds that were meant to protect them both to do it. She sighed deeply and picked up the phone to dial Kenneth. The weight of the upcoming trial pressed on her, but she couldn't afford to back down now. She needed to prepare. She needed to be ready for what was coming. When Kenneth answered, his voice was steady, but Margaret could sense the tension in his words. "We're getting closer, Margaret. They've started leaking more rumors to the press. James is going public with the claim that you're suffering from cognitive decline, that you're unfit to make decisions. He's trying to poison the court of public opinion." Margaret's heart sank, but she held her ground. "Let them talk. The truth will come out. I have the evidence. I'm not going to let him destroy everything I've worked for, Kenneth. Not again." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Kenneth spoke again, his voice softer now. "I know. And you're doing the right thing. But you need to brace yourself. This is going to be brutal. James is pulling out all the stops. You'll need to stay strong." "I will," Margaret said, the certainty in her voice surprising even her. "I've made my decision, and I won't let him win. This isn't just about money, it's about respect. I've trusted him, and he's betrayed that trust." She stood up from the desk, walking toward the window, her eyes scanning the horizon. The first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. She felt an overwhelming sense of calm wash over her, the storm in her heart finally settling. Kenneth's voice broke the silence. "We'll need to prepare for the courtroom, Margaret. The press will be there. James is already playing the victim, trying to manipulate the narrative. But with what we've got, we can't lose." Margaret took a deep breath. The weight of the battle ahead was still heavy, but for the first time, it felt like a weight she could bear. This wasn't just about the fight she was about to face. It was about the strength she had found within herself. The strength to say no. The strength to protect everything she had built. "I'm ready," she said again, her voice unwavering. "I'm ready to face him. And I'll do whatever it takes to make sure the truth is heard." As she hung up the phone, Margaret looked once more at the photo of her husband, a quiet smile on his face. She had made promises to him, promises she would keep, no matter the cost. This trial, this battle, it wasn't just about her. It was about protecting the legacy they had built together. And this time, Margaret wouldn't let anyone tear it down. The courtroom was filled with tension, the air thick with anticipation. Margaret sat at the front, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the judge's bench as the murmur of conversation from the spectators swirled around her. The soft rustling of papers and the occasional shuffle of feet seemed to echo louder than usual, as if the space itself were holding its breath, waiting for the battle to unfold. James's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man with an air of arrogance that seemed almost palpable, stood up to address the court. He was a seasoned professional, clearly accustomed to bending the truth to fit his narrative. Margaret could already feel the weight of his eyes on her as he began his opening statement, his tone smooth and persuasive. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the lawyer began, his voice dripping with sympathy. "This case is not about the law, but about a family torn apart by the actions of a woman in distress. A woman who, due to her grief and emotional instability, has made a decision that is not in her son's best interest. A decision made not out of logic, but out of a deep, emotional upset that clouds her judgment." Margaret's pulse didn't quicken. She didn't flinch. She had expected this. She had known James would play the victim, cast himself as the son who had been wronged by a mother who had snapped under pressure. It was exactly what they wanted to believe. But Margaret was done letting them control her narrative. Her focus shifted to Kenneth, who sat beside her, his face calm but his eyes sharp. He had been through this kind of battle before, and Margaret took solace in the steady confidence he projected. He was the one who would speak for her, the one who would dismantle every lie James and his lawyer tried to weave. Margaret had no intention of defending herself emotionally. She had already made that clear to Kenneth. As James's lawyer continued, Margaret's mind stayed clear, her resolve unwavering. His words were nothing but an emotional plea, a thinly veiled attempt to make her seem like a grieving, irrational woman. He made it sound as though she were acting out of petty resentment, not out of a justified need to protect herself. But then, it was Kenneth's turn. He stood up, his posture relaxed, his voice measured and calm. He moved with the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly how to navigate the intricate world of legal battles. His words were precise, facts carefully laid out as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Kenneth began, his voice cutting through the lawyer's emotional rhetoric with surgical precision. "This is not a case about grief. It is not about a mother acting out of spite. This is a case about responsibility. A case about a son who has continuously disregarded the boundaries set by his mother. A son who, over the course of years, has demonstrated nothing but selfishness, entitlement, and a total disregard for the very trust his mother placed in him." Margaret could feel the weight of Kenneth's words pressing down on the room. His calmness was the perfect counterbalance to the lawyer's theatrical pleas. Kenneth didn't need to rely on emotion. He was presenting facts, and it was undeniable. The evidence was irrefutable. He continued, listing instances of James's reckless behavior, his inability to manage money, the countless loans from family members that went unpaid, the irresponsible spending, the countless promises broken. With each point, the atmosphere in the courtroom seemed to shift, as if the truth was slowly starting to seep into the minds of those watching. James's lawyer tried to interrupt, but Kenneth was unwavering, his voice gaining strength with each fact presented. "James Taylor has proven, time and time again, that he is not responsible enough to handle his inheritance," Kenneth stated, his voice steady. "The very fact that he is now challenging his mother's decision only further demonstrates his entitlement. He believes that, despite his behavior, he is owed something he has not earned and has certainly not respected." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Margaret could see James's face from the corner of her eye. His jaw was clenched, his fists gripping the arms of his chair. He was trying to maintain control, but his desperation was becoming clear. The facade was slipping. Margaret's calm, collected demeanor stood in stark contrast to his growing agitation. The family members present in the courtroom, those who had once been swayed by James's manipulative charm, began to exchange uneasy glances. Margaret noticed this. She could see them shifting in their seats, starting to question James's motives. The cracks in his carefully constructed image were starting to show, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. James has had every opportunity to change, Kenneth continued, his voice a calm storm of reason. But he hasn't. He's used his mother's trust as a safety net, and it's time that trust is revoked. Margaret Taylor's decision is her right. It is not one made lightly, nor is it one born of emotion. It is a decision born of years of manipulation, betrayal, and a complete lack of respect for the boundaries she had set. Margaret sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of the battle lift slightly. Kenneth's words had cut through the emotional fog, bringing the truth into the light. James's manipulation no longer held the power it once did. The truth was undeniable, and now it was out in the open for all to see. As the day wore on, the courtroom battle continued, but Margaret's confidence never wavered. She was done being manipulated. She was done being the villain in James's twisted version of their story. The pressure was immense, but Margaret had withstood it. And when the trial ended, she knew she would stand victorious. But as the day drew to a close, one thing was clear. This fight was far from over. James wasn't done yet, and neither was she. The courtroom was still, the weight of silence hanging thick in the air. Margaret's nerves, already taut with the strain of the trial, tightened further as the judge returned from recess. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, the weight of the jury's gaze pressing down, all awaiting the next round of this brutal family drama. Margaret sat still, her back straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She could almost hear the low hum of her heartbeat, but she didn't allow herself to waver. This was her moment. She wasn't going to let James or anyone else take it from her. The judge took his seat, the gavel striking sharply, and the room grew quiet once again. "Thank you," the judge said, his voice rich with authority. "We've heard plenty of accusations and emotional arguments, but now it's time for clarity." He adjusted his glasses, looking over the court with an air of finality. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. There was something about the judge's demeanor, his posture, his focused gaze, that made her feel like they were about to hear something significant. Kenneth sat beside her, his jaw set with the same confidence he had carried throughout the trial. James's lawyer, standing to the side, looked nervous. He'd made his emotional plea, his voice soaring as he tried to paint Margaret as a grieving, unstable woman. But the judge had been quiet, taking in the facts without any visible emotion. Now it seemed that all the careful manipulation was about to unravel. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, the judge continued, his voice cutting through the tension, "It is clear to me that the accusations of undue influence are baseless." He paused, glancing at Margaret with a professional nod. This case has not been about grief or emotional instability, but about clear and consistent decisions made by the plaintiff. Margaret Taylor has acted within her rights, and the decision to revise her will was made deliberately and with full understanding. James's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, his confident stance slipping. But Margaret stayed focused, holding her breath, waiting for the next words to fall. "There has been no indication," the judge went on, "that Margaret Taylor's actions were influenced by anything other than her desire to ensure that her estate is handled in the way she deems best. The defense's claim of manipulation holds no merit. It's been an emotional appeal without substantive evidence." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. James's lawyer opened his mouth, but the judge held up a hand, silencing him with a swift motion. The judge's words were as solid as a wall, unshakable, and Margaret felt a small thrill of victory stir within her chest. James's eyes from across the room were wide with disbelief. His jaw clenched tight, his fists trembling at his sides. Margaret saw him, the mask of calm slipping away entirely, and for the first time in this trial, he looked like the boy who had been caught red-handed. There was no more bravado, just desperation. "Mr. Taylor," the judge continued, directing his attention to James, "you are welcome to present any further evidence, but let me remind you that your behavior has been well documented, and no one here is unaware of the repeated irresponsibilities that led to this situation. Your claim to this inheritance is, frankly, misplaced." Margaret could see James's lawyer gathering his papers, clearly scrambling to find a new angle, but the judge wasn't having it. The words felt like a hammer hitting the nail. There was no more room for manipulation. Then Kenneth stood up, his voice calm and steady as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, I would like to submit further evidence to reinforce what has already been presented. We have bank records, loan agreements, and a detailed history of James Taylor's financial irresponsibility that spans over the last decade." Kenneth turned, motioning to the files on the table, stacked neatly and organized. "This isn't a matter of emotion. It's a matter of repeated failure and disregard for the trust that Margaret Taylor extended to her son." Margaret's stomach clenched as she watched James's lawyer wilt under the barrage of facts. It wasn't just the money, it was the whole picture, the complete disregard James had shown for his family, for his mother's patience, for the love she had given him. Kenneth continued, "James's behavior has consistently proven that he cannot be trusted with the assets of this estate. He's shown nothing but entitlement and a refusal to be accountable for his actions. No one has had the audacity to say it outright, but we are here to say it. James Taylor does not deserve a place in his mother's legacy." James's lawyer attempted a feeble counter, but it was no use. Every time he tried to spin a defense, Kenneth was right there, with the next damning piece of evidence, ready to pull the rug out from under him. The courtroom began to shift, the scales tipping in Margaret's favor as her case became clearer and clearer. She wasn't the villain. She was the victim of her son's manipulation, and everyone could see it. And then, in one last desperate move, James stood up, his voice shaking with emotion as he addressed the judge. "Mom, please!" he cried, his voice a mix of anger and pain. "You're making a huge mistake. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. You can't just take everything away from me like this. I need you." The desperation in his voice filled the room, but the more he spoke, the more he revealed his true nature, his need for control, his inability to take responsibility. The tears in his eyes were nothing but a mask, a final attempt to manipulate the court. But Margaret remained still, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't moved by his theatrics. The truth was stronger than his pleas. The judge cleared his throat, ready to make his final statement. "I have heard enough," he said, his voice resolute. "The will stands. Margaret Taylor's decision is final. Mr. Taylor, your claims have no legal merit. The will is valid, and your attempt to challenge it is dismissed." Margaret felt the weight lift from her shoulders, and for the first time in this trial, she allowed herself a breath. She had won. The truth had prevailed. As the gavel struck and the courtroom buzzed with murmurs, Margaret stood. The journey had been long, and the battle was far from over, but in this moment she knew she had done what was right. And James? He would have to learn, just like everyone else, that there were consequences for his actions. The courtroom emptied out in a quiet swirl of murmurs, the energy still crackling with the aftermath of the judgment. Margaret sat at the front, her gaze fixed on the judge's bench as the gavel struck one last time. The ruling was official. James was disinherited. No amount of pleading, no emotional outbursts could change that now. She let the words sink in. He is out. He has no claim on me, on my life, on my legacy. For so many years, Margaret had been driven by guilt, by the fear of what might happen if she severed the ties that bound her to her son. But as the courtroom doors swung open and the sounds of the crowd slowly faded, a sense of finality washed over her. There was no guilt, No regret. Only peace. Kenneth stood beside her, offering a small, approving nod as they made their way toward the exit. Margaret's steps were steady. The trial was over. The battle had been won. James had no legal claim to anything she had worked for. Outside, the afternoon sun bathed the courtyard in warm light. Margaret took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs. It felt almost surreal. The quiet after the storm, the space to breathe. To exist without the weight of her son's manipulation bearing down on her. As they walked toward the car, a familiar voice called out. "Margaret!" She turned, finding James standing a few feet away. His face was pale, his posture slumped, the usual arrogance gone. His eyes were still filled with that old, familiar mix of frustration and desperation, but now, there was something else. A flicker of fear. "Mom," he began, his voice softer than she had expected. I just want to apologize. This whole thing, it's not how I wanted it to end. I never meant for things to get so bad." Margaret's heart twisted for a moment. She'd heard this before, countless times. His hollow apologies, his promises that he would change, that he was better now. But she had learned the hard way that his words were just another form of manipulation. She didn't say anything. She simply stared at him, waiting for him to finish. "I'm sorry," James repeated, his voice cracking slightly as if that might make her believe him this time. "I really didn't mean to hurt you. I was just trying to survive. You have to understand that. I needed the money, Mom." His words hit her like a slap in the face, but Margaret didn't flinch. She was done letting him twist her emotions. She had given him so many chances, and each time he had taken them for granted. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes cold and calm. Then, finally, she spoke. "I'm not interested in your apologies, James. You've had your chances. You've stolen from me. You've disrespected me. And now, you've lost everything." James opened his mouth to argue, but she raised a hand to stop him. "Enough," she said quietly but firmly. "You're out of my life, and you're out of my will. You don't deserve anything from me. Not my love, not my trust, not my money. This is the end of the road." James stood there, his eyes wide with disbelief. For the first time, he didn't have any words. The arrogance, the manipulation, it was all gone. In its place was something else. Realization. Margaret could see the dawning recognition in his eyes that she was serious, that this time, there would be no coming back. "Mom." His voice was barely a whisper now, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked toward the car, Kenneth beside her. She didn't need to say anything more. There was nothing left to say. As they drove away from the courthouse, the cityscape passing by in a blur, Margaret felt the weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't over. She knew that. James would probably try to make more trouble. His desperation would fuel him to find another way to manipulate her. But in this moment, it didn't matter. She had made the right decision. She had stood her ground. For the first time in years, she felt free. Back at her home, Margaret walked through the front door, the familiar surroundings now feeling more like her sanctuary than ever before. She paused in the hallway, looking at the family portraits on the walls, the pictures of a life she had built with love, dedication, and hard work. James wasn't a part of that life anymore. And that was exactly how it should be. She sat in her favorite armchair by the window, watching the sun dip lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the horizon. It had been a long, difficult road to get here, but she was finally at peace. She had made the right choice. The storm was over, and now Margaret could breathe. The months that followed the trial felt like a slow but steady unraveling of everything that had once seemed complicated in Margaret's life. With James out of her life, the house felt quieter, almost lighter, as if the weight of his manipulation had been lifted from her shoulders. She had no time for regret, no energy to waste on guilt. Instead, Margaret took action. The wealth James had once thought was his by birthright became the foundation for something far more important. She poured the inheritance into causes that had long been close to her heart: charitable organizations, educational foundations, and initiatives that focused on empowering women. The money was no longer a tool for her son's careless ambitions. It would now work toward building a future for others. Margaret's first donation was to a program that mentored at-risk young women, offering them the chance to develop skills, gain mentorship, and ultimately pursue careers they never thought possible. It was a program she had come across years ago and always intended to support, back when she still believed her son would change and take his place alongside her. The money would now fund scholarships for women in need, a legacy of empowerment where James's selfishness had once stood. She expanded her giving to healthcare initiatives, helping fund new research into women's heart disease, which had been a passion project of hers for years. She even invested in a new community center that would provide safe spaces for families, including job training, childcare, and mental health support. Each donation was purposeful, each project a reflection of the values she had always upheld: strength, independence, and support for those who needed it most. Kenneth, ever the reliable partner in these decisions, continued to advise her. He helped ensure that every step she took with the estate was legally sound, every donation secure and true to her intentions. The wealth that had been intended to cushion James's endless cycle of mistakes was now a tool for real, lasting change. Margaret could feel the difference in her every time she signed off on another project, every time she read an update on the impact her contributions were making. It was as though a new chapter of her life had begun. But as the months passed, she couldn't help but think of James. He had been so sure of his place in her future, so certain that he could manipulate her into submission. Without his mother's fortune to fall back on, he began to struggle. Margaret heard rumors about his financial difficulties, about the once stable job he had lost due to repeated lateness and irresponsibility. Friends who once had lent him money were no longer willing to help him out. There was no safety net now, no one to bail him out of the mess he had made of his own life. The phone calls from him, once frequent and manipulative, had stopped. There were no more attempts to apologize, no more excuses. Margaret had expected him to try again, but in the months after the trial, the silence was loud. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a silence that said more than his words ever could. She wasn't happy that he was struggling, but she wasn't surprised either. She had spent decades covering up his failures, providing him with the life he had taken for granted. Now, he would have to face the consequences of his actions, just like everyone else. Kenneth checked in on her frequently, his professional advice laced with his personal friendship. "Margaret," he said one afternoon, when they were reviewing another set of documents for a new grant, "I just wanted to confirm everything is in place with the estate. It's been sealed legally, no more loopholes for James to exploit." Margaret nodded, the weight of those words settling in her chest. The estate was finally closed. Everything was secure. Everything was intact. There was no longer any worry that James would come crawling back, looking for a way to undo the decisions she had made. The legal battle was over. She had done what was necessary, and now she could truly move forward. "That's good to hear," Margaret replied, her voice steady. "Thank you, Kenneth, for everything. I couldn't have done this without you." "Always here for you, Margaret," he said, his tone warm but professional. "You did the hard part." She smiled softly, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the document in front of her. She was proud of herself, proud of how she had stood firm in the face of her son's manipulation. She had been weak for so long, letting guilt and love cloud her decisions. But not anymore. She had built something meaningful, something that would outlast the petty drama of her son's demands. And yet, despite the sense of relief, a part of her still couldn't fully shake the past. She thought of her husband, how he had been there for her when they first built this life together, how they had dreamed of what their legacy would be. The legacy had shifted now, but it felt right. The wealth that had once been a burden to her heart was now a beacon of hope for so many. "Everything you've built is something real, Margaret." Kenneth's voice brought her back to the present. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze as he continued. "You've done it. You've given yourself a legacy, one that will truly make a difference." Margaret smiled, her heart light. "I'm finally free, Kenneth. And I'm proud of what I've created." As she walked through her home, looking at the photos of her late husband, her thoughts settled on the future, on the path she had now paved for herself. The house felt quieter, but it was the kind of quiet that brought peace, not loneliness. It was a peace she had worked hard for, one that came from finally standing on her own terms. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light over the horizon. Margaret stood at the window, looking out over the world she had made, a legacy of her own, one that no one could ever take away. And for the first time in years, Margaret felt truly at peace. The days that followed were slow and deliberate. The house, now free of the tension that had once permeated every corner, felt like a sanctuary. Margaret had made it her own again, returning to the peaceful rhythms she had once known. The soft hum of morning sunlight, the scent of fresh coffee drifting through the kitchen, the soft tick of the clock as time passed unhurried. All of it filled her with a calm she hadn't realized she'd been missing. Her life, once consumed by the complexities of family drama and manipulation, had simplified itself into something she hadn't known she needed: peace. She spent her mornings tending to the small but meaningful projects she had always dreamed of. Her new initiatives in philanthropy flourished, each donation and partnership bringing more purpose to her days. Margaret worked closely with organizations that reflected her values, taking a more active role in causes that empowered others, particularly women, just as she had always envisioned. But there was something else, something that had taken root deep inside her. In the quiet moments, Margaret felt herself reconnecting with the simple pleasures of life: gardening, reading, enjoying long walks with Kenneth, who had become not just a legal advisor, but a close and dependable friend. The peace she had chosen was not merely about solitude. It was about living a life where her choices were her own, where she was free from the expectations of others. Yet, James was never far from her thoughts. His calls had stopped for a while, but soon they began again. His desperation was palpable in every voicemail, in every email, and finally, in his texts. "I can't believe you did this," one of his messages read. "Please, Mom, just hear me out. This can't be the end." Margaret didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had already said everything that needed to be said. Every message from him was just a reminder of how far he would go to manipulate her. The lines he crossed, the promises he broke, the endless excuses. She couldn't afford to let his desperation drag her back into the toxic cycle. Not again. There were moments when the silence of his absence felt like an ache, but it was not a painful one. It was the kind of ache that comes when you've finally freed yourself from the weight of someone else's control. The ache of release. Margaret had become a symbol of strength in her community, a quiet, unyielding figure whose resolve was admired by those who had watched her journey. She was often invited to speak at charity events, where she shared her story not of grief, but of empowerment, of standing up for herself when it mattered most. Her transparency about her personal struggles and her commitment to turning her pain into something purposeful earned her the respect of those who knew her. Her friends rallied around her. Lily, her best friend, had always been a voice of reason, and now she saw Margaret not just as a survivor, but as someone who had reclaimed her life and her future. Sophie, her sister, who had always walked the line between family loyalty and honesty, was now fully on her side. She had watched James's behavior unravel and, for the first time, she saw him for what he truly was: manipulative, entitled, and selfish. Margaret's decision was not just the right one, it was the necessary one. Margaret's resolve had ripple effects. Her friends and family began to admire her strength, her ability to walk away from something that had once consumed her. They began to see her not as the mother who had disinherited her son, but as a woman who had finally taken control of her own life. Meanwhile, James struggled. His calls grew more frantic. "I didn't mean it, Mom. Please." He texted again and again, his pleas growing more desperate. But the more he tried to reach her, the more he revealed his true nature: a man who had never taken responsibility for his actions, who had always believed the world owed him something. Without the financial cushion he had once relied on, James was forced to confront his own failures. Margaret heard rumors of his increasing debts, of his inability to hold down a job, of the friendships and relationships that had crumbled under the weight of his irresponsibility. He no longer had the safety net of his mother's wealth to catch him, and the realization seemed to push him further into a spiral of bitterness and confusion. Margaret wasn't happy about his struggles, but neither was she surprised. This was the consequence of his own actions. She had tried for so many years to help him, to show him the way. But now he would have to learn the hard way, and Margaret could finally, truly, let him go. She stood one evening, gazing out the window at the horizon, the last light of the day bathing the landscape in gold. Her hands were warm in her lap, her breathing steady. She had chosen this life, a life of purpose, of quiet strength. It wasn't about wealth, about things that could be taken away. It was about what she had built, what she was leaving behind. The legacy she was creating had nothing to do with inheritance. It was about empowerment, about making a difference. It was about peace. As she thought about the lessons she had learned, about standing firm, about reclaiming her life, she knew she had done the right thing. It hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. And she had learned, above all else, that the hardest decisions were often the most important ones. She felt the weight of her choices, not as a burden, but as a shield. The storm had passed. And now, Margaret could move forward in the quiet peace of knowing she had made the right decision, for herself, and for the future she was building. James had never imagined his life without his mother's wealth to cushion every blow. It was a safety net he had relied on for as long as he could remember, woven together by a web of manipulation, excuses, and promises that he had always known Margaret would forgive. But now, as reality slammed into him with brutal clarity, he was left to pick up the pieces of a life he had taken for granted. The first few weeks were the hardest. The savings he had thought would last forever dwindled quickly, drained by his bad habits, his inability to budget, and the mounting debts he had ignored for years. His phone rang with creditor calls, and each day he spent searching for a job only highlighted his growing desperation. He wasn't prepared for this. He wasn't prepared for the real world, the one without his mother's fortune to protect him from his own recklessness. At first, James tried to hide the depth of his struggles from Rachel, his girlfriend. She had always been the one to comfort him, to assure him that things would get better. But as his financial problems grew, so did the tension between them. He couldn't afford to keep up appearances anymore, and the pressure began to take its toll on their relationship. Rachel was starting to see the cracks. She had always been supportive, but as James's excuses wore thin, her patience did too. "I don't understand, James," she said one night, her voice strained. "Why can't you just get a regular job?" You can't keep blaming everything on your mom. She's not the reason you're in this mess. James's frustration bubbled over. You don't get it, Rachel. I didn't ask for this. She took everything from me. Everything I was supposed to have. Gone. I can't rebuild this on my own. Rachel shook her head, her eyes filled with disbelief. You never learned how to stand on your own 2 feet, James. You've always expected someone else to fix your problems. You need to take responsibility for your life. Her words stung, but James couldn't argue. He had spent years trying to manipulate his way out of responsibility, and now, when the world refused to coddle him, he was lost. The fight ended with Rachel leaving. She packed her things and left him in that apartment, the last tie he had to a life he couldn't afford. Her absence was a painful reminder that his manipulation wasn't enough to keep her around. It wasn't enough to fix anything. Back at the house, Margaret had no idea of the turmoil James was enduring. Her days had grown simpler, her focus now on her newfound purpose. She threw herself into mentoring young women, helping them learn the lessons of independence she had come to value so deeply. She spoke to groups about the importance of financial independence, the strength that comes from standing firm in your own decisions. Her wealth was now a tool for change, funding scholarships, building foundations, and opening doors for women who had been overlooked, just as she had been when she was young. Margaret's new role in her community had made her a symbol of resilience. People came to her for advice, for support. She shared her story with them, of the mistakes she had made, the lessons she had learned, and the peace she had found in walking away from what no longer served her. Each conversation, each mentoring session, reminded her of how far she had come. She wasn't just living for herself anymore, she was living for others too. One afternoon, as Margaret walked through her garden, a soft breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers. She paused beside a rose bush, taking in the vibrant colors, the gentle rustle of leaves. It was a moment of quiet reflection, one of many that had become more frequent as time passed. She had built something meaningful, something that no one could take from her. She thought of James, but there was no longer any bitterness in her heart. He was out of her life now, and that had been the right choice. It was hard at first, but now, she saw him for what he was, a man who had never learned to stand on his own, who had always relied on others to pick up the pieces. Now, he was finally being forced to face the consequences of his actions. It wasn't her responsibility to carry him anymore. As Margaret stood there, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin, she couldn't help but smile quietly to herself. She had finally broken free of his manipulation. For the first time in years, she felt like she was living her life on her own terms, without the weight of someone else's expectations crushing her spirit. James, on the other hand, was still floundering. With each passing day, he became more desperate, more isolated. His attempts to reach Margaret continued, but they had long since been ignored. The calls went unanswered, the texts unread. His life was falling apart, and there was nothing she could do about it. He had to face the truth. He was the architect of his own misery. As Margaret walked back to the house, her heart light, she knew the struggle ahead was still far from over. James might try again. He might attempt to manipulate someone else into helping him, but Margaret was done being his safety net. She had made the right choice. She had stood firm when it mattered most. And with that peace, she could finally move forward. Her life was hers again. Margaret's life had become a testament to the strength she had found in herself. The foundation she had poured her heart into flourished in ways she had never imagined. What had once been a quiet vision had grown into a vibrant reality, funding scholarships for young women, creating safe spaces for those in need, and supporting causes that empowered people to take control of their futures. She found herself in meetings with leaders of organizations, shaking hands with people whose work she admired. But more than that, Margaret found joy in the tangible difference her wealth now made. Her money was no longer a shield for James's mistakes. It had become a tool for lasting change, a way to give back to the world in ways that honored the lessons she had learned throughout her life. The young women she mentored began to thrive, gaining the independence and self-respect they had lacked before. Some graduated from college, others started businesses, and some took positions in nonprofits that aligned with the values Margaret held so dear. Each success felt like another brick in the foundation she was building, not just for herself, but for a new generation of women who could look at Margaret's journey and see a path forward. Yet, even as her professional life soared, Margaret couldn't entirely escape thoughts of James. The silence that had stretched between them had been deafening, but as she observed the growing success of her foundation, she couldn't help but think of how different things could have been had James taken responsibility for his actions, had he learned the lessons of independence she now imparted to others. James's struggle was real, and it was unfolding in front of her eyes, though she was no longer a part of it. He had no safety net now, no one to bail him out. The constant phone calls and texts had stopped, replaced by news from mutual acquaintances, whispers about his increasing debts, about his inability to find steady work, about the apartment he could barely afford. Margaret didn't feel joy in his failure, but neither did she feel guilt. This was his journey to make. It was his responsibility now. He had the same opportunities as anyone else, but he had never chosen to use them. The wealth she had once considered leaving him had gone elsewhere, into the hands of those who would use it to build something lasting. As Margaret traveled, visiting the communities she had helped support, her work became the measure of her true wealth, not the dollar amounts in her bank account, but the change she was making. She spent time in places she'd never thought to visit before, sitting in humble rooms with young women who had found hope because of the very projects she had funded. It was fulfilling in ways that money had never been, in ways that James's apologies or his promises had never been. She sat on the beach in a small coastal town in Italy one afternoon, the sun low in the sky, painting the water with hues of orange and gold. She had flown there alone, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the quiet comfort of knowing she had earned this time for herself. As the waves rolled in, Margaret closed her eyes, letting the sounds of the sea wash over her. There were no demands on her time here, no messages from James, no guilt, no expectations. Just peace. The press began to take notice, though. A feature story on her life, on how she had turned personal loss into a force for good, was published in several major newspapers. Magazine covers began to bear her image, not as a woman who had been cast as a villain in her own family, but as one of strength and resilience. Her decision to disinherit James was not something the media ignored, but the focus had shifted. Instead of focusing on the fractured family, they celebrated the woman who had turned her pain into power, who had given up the safety net to build something far greater. At a gala honoring philanthropists, Margaret was presented with an award for her contributions to women's causes. Standing at the podium, she looked out at the crowd, feeling the warmth of their applause. She wasn't accustomed to public accolades, but the recognition felt different now, because it wasn't just about her. It was about the women whose lives had been touched, about the future she had shaped with the choices she had made. As the night wore on, Margaret stepped away from the crowd, her thoughts drifting to the people who had always stood by her, Lily, Sophie, and even Kenneth, who had seen her through the darkest parts of her journey. She had finally built the life she had always dreamed of, but it wasn't just the money that had made it happen. It was the decision she had made, the strength to face her fears, to face her son, and to finally choose her own peace over the expectations of others. The legacy she had forged was more than just a foundation or a list of donations. It was the lives she had touched, the paths she had helped create. It was the women who would now walk stronger because she had stood firm when it mattered most. As Margaret returned home, The peacefulness that had settled into her life felt like a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She had fought for this peace, and now she had it. The garden outside her home seemed to bloom more brightly, reflecting the serenity she had built. With each passing day, she was reminded that the most important legacy wasn't one tied to wealth, it was one tied to the strength of her choices. As she walked through the door, her gaze shifted to the window, and she couldn't help but smile quietly. The world was still moving forward, but Margaret was no longer afraid. She had built her future, and it was beautiful. The hardest decisions had led her here, and now she was free. Margaret stood backstage, her hands resting lightly on the podium as the murmurs of the crowd filled the air. She could feel the energy in the room, the anticipation, the quiet respect, and a small spark of nervousness that still managed to creep into her chest. It had been years since she'd spoken in front of a crowd this large, but this time it was different. This time she was no longer the woman struggling under the weight of family expectations and personal sacrifice. This time she was the woman who had fought for her future, and for the futures of others. The invitation to speak at the annual Women's Empowerment Summit had come as a surprise, but the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. Margaret had become a symbol of resilience, not just because of her financial success, but because of the choices she had made, the ones that had defined her as a woman in control of her own destiny. She stepped forward as the applause died down, the microphone picking up the soft click of her heels on the floor. The bright lights above her illuminated the stage, casting a warm glow on the sea of faces that looked up at her. Margaret cleared her throat, her voice calm but filled with purpose. "Good evening, everyone. I'm honored to be here with you today," she began, her words flowing effortlessly. "I've been asked to speak about strength, about what it means to stand up for yourself when everything around you tells you to be quiet, to stay in line, to wait for the next time you're needed. But my story isn't just about standing up for myself. It's about making the decision to walk away from the things that are holding you back, the things that drain your energy, the things that make you feel small." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd, the faces of women, some young, some older, who had come to hear her story, to learn from her journey. She felt the weight of their gaze but no longer felt the burden of needing their approval. "For years, I was the woman who tried to fix everyone. I tried to protect those I loved, even when they didn't respect me in return," Margaret continued. "But I realized, at a certain point, that sometimes the hardest thing to do isn't fighting for someone else. It's fighting for yourself. It's choosing to protect your own peace, your own future." A murmur of agreement spread through the room. Margaret smiled softly to herself, her heart swelling with pride. She was no longer just telling her story. She was teaching others how to live their own truths. "Today, I stand before you not because of the wealth I built, but because of the strength I found when I stopped letting others define my worth," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "I made a choice to let go of a future that no longer served me. I let go of the idea that I had to carry someone else's burdens, and in doing that, I found freedom." The room was quiet, hanging on every word. Margaret could feel the ripple of impact her words were having, the connection she was making with these women who understood her struggle, who had fought their own battles in silence. "As you move forward in your lives," she continued, "I want you to remember this. You are not defined by the things that weigh you down. You are defined by your choices, by the strength you find to say no to what isn't serving you, to say yes to the future you want to build, even when it feels hard, even when it feels like the hardest thing you'll ever do." The applause was louder this time. Margaret could feel her heart swell with something deeper than pride. It was peace. A peace that only came when you truly understood that you were in control of your own life, that you no longer had to answer to anyone else's expectations or manipulations. Later that evening, after the event, Margaret stood outside in the cool night air taking a deep breath. Her work was only just beginning. The foundation she had built was thriving. Her scholarships, her programs for young women, her support for families in need. Every day it was touching more lives, changing more futures. But as she walked back to the car, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen, her heart sinking as she saw the name. James. Her thumb hovered over the message. The years of frustration, the pain, the betrayal, all of it rushed back for a moment. His last message, the one that had finally driven her to cut ties, still echoed in her mind. "You've ruined my life. You'll regret this." But Margaret had no regrets. She had made her choice, and every day since had proven it was the right one. She opened the text. "I'm sorry. Please talk to me. I need you." Margaret stared at the words for a long moment. She had known this day might come, the day when James would try to reach her again. But now, as she read his message, she felt no desire to answer. No more guilt. No more attempts to make her feel responsible for his failures. With a small sigh, she typed her response. "It's too late." She hit send, and the weight that had lingered for so long seemed to lift from her shoulders. She didn't need him anymore. She didn't need to be pulled back into his world of manipulation. That evening, as Margaret sat in her garden, watching the sky turn from gold to violet, a deep sense of fulfillment washed over her. She had fought for her peace, for her future, and now she had it. The legacy she had built wasn't just a foundation, it was a movement, a living, breathing testament to what could be achieved when a woman decided to stand firm and claim her own future. She leaned back in her chair, looking out at the horizon, her heart full. "They tried to take everything from me," she whispered to the quiet night. "But they never took my peace."